Да, но там уже есть. А, ну да, еще важная тема. Да, да, да.
We continue our work at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. The topic is how open data helps to fight corruption, achievements of 2018 and plans for 2019. Zubko, Project Director, Enhanced Public Sector Transparency and Integrity, UNDP. Vasyl Zadvornyi, Director General of the State Enterprise ProZorro. Natalia Forsiuk, Director of the National Secretariat Coast Ukraine, UNDP Expert and Moderator. Nadiya Babynska-Virna, UNDP Open Data Expert. First word is given to Nadiya. We are really glad to see you all here and our honorable speakers. We are going to speak about data as the instrument of fighting corruption. 90% of Ukrainians believe that corruption is one of the main problems in Ukraine, and 61% believe that corruption prevents Ukraine from development and from moving to the right direction. And the international community and NGOs in Ukraine and the state should do everything possible in order to overcome this phenomenon and to provide transparency and impartiality. And UNDP has such a project of transparency and integrity of this sector, and UNDP does a lot to promote transparency and open data as an instrument that allows to open information and to work with information in possession of the bodies of power, and also helps to control and to fight corruption. And I would like to ask Diana about these projects of UNDP in Ukraine and how data helps to provide transparency and integrity of the sector, and also how, due to open data, we can create some instruments, some services for people and for power in order to decrease the level of corruption. Thank you, Nadiya. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear audience. UNDP in Ukraine works on the project of democratic governance for many years, and starting 2014, several areas were intensified because new legislation was introduced, and at the end of 2014, several anti-corruption laws were adopted, and this was the package of anti-corruption laws. The law on the main law changed the system of anti-corruption bodies, and part of the law concerning prevention of corruption was the basis for the activity of the project mentioned by Nadiya. So about transparency and integrity in the public sector. This is supported by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, the main donor and partner of UNDP in changes for better democracy in the country. So about the activity in this area. In order to prevent corruption, it was decided by people's deputies, by the government of Ukraine, that there should be better transparency in the sector, in the public sector. And local government and people who hold positions, they should publicly declare their earnings, and this data should be available for the people in the format of open data. And this system was created on the initiative of the government together with the UNDP and newly created Agency of Prevention of Corruption, and the system is known as the system of e-declarations. So there were two full-fledged waves of declarations, and in the system there are about 3 million declarations that were submitted about the assets, and these documents are not only submitted, but they are available for the public and analysts, for journalists, for all those who work with data. So what can we do with this data? This component mentioned So this component on the enhanced public sector transparency and integrity, it aims not only to create the system. It was important to understand whether the system be valuable for the citizens, to what extent, and what the public can do with it. So there was sociological survey carried out by JFK, and UNDP put a question whether the data from declarations be used while taking decision about voting during elections. And people who know about the system of declaration, this is 85% of the citizens, 37% said that they plan to use the system of e-declarations, the data that is placed on the site. When they decide for whom to vote, 10% of people, it was difficult for them to respond. Others didn't plan to participate in elections or didn't consider using this data. So the main users are activists and journalists. In the project Enhanced Public Sector and Transparency and Integrity, 1/3 of our work is focused on this audience, and they may address the register, and they worked in their own area concerning some projects in different parts of Ukraine. So what did activists do? They verified whether the data entered into declarations, whether they correspond the views of the people on integrity and transparency. And journalists often considered this register as a list of assets. But the aim was to show publicly in what way public figures live and how their assets change year after year, and to increase trust in top officials and also to local government and this level of assets, if it corresponds the salary. One can understand that the candidates who go to elections and those who are nominated to positions, that they are those officials who we can trust, who can take proper decisions for the community or a settlement or oblast. So public activists used this resource for this, and they show the options. They didn't want to discredit anyone, and the UNDP promoted this idea. They wanted to show impartial citizens, those officials who declare properly, and they write about these people, and also it was not enough the system is not enough to restore the trust to the candidates, to deputies. They should have verified the data through other registers that got connected to the system in order to provide electronic verification. And one of these registers is the huge database of ProZorro. And the activists verified some things in the areas, and they verified conflict of interests while taking decisions. Maybe some deputies could have connections with some companies, and this data of ProZorro was really of use. And each NGO provided reports on this information. And I would like to end my brief presentation, and I would like to say that we should provide not only opportunities and the digitalization of data, we should provide opportunities of access to this data. It is important that people use this data, and they should use it for practical things. And one of the examples we want to show today is the use of registers and the use of ProZorro and other open data. So it can be used for monitoring of repair of roads and to follow whether these repair roads were of quality, whether the money was spent properly. So this component was supported. This project was supported by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, and we would like to share those results.
Well, I think that in the meantime, while we are sitting here, maybe a lot of managers have downloaded the documents from the ProZorro system, and the representatives of small and medium enterprises are preparing their bids and putting forward their bids for different procurements. For example, when I contact the representatives of the businesses and ask them about the instruments available for bidding procedures, ProZorro is very well known. The day before yesterday, for example, I was in the Court of Appeals of Ukraine, and I saw there for myself that those people who were interested, they knew very well how to use the ProZorro system and how, for example, the procurement procedures could be controlled, the flow of funds could be seen by the public, and I'm sure that ProZorro is now an emblem of electronic democracy, about open data, about civic involvement of the public, because it's a symbol of interaction between the civil society and the government, because it's an innovative instrument, not only for Ukraine, but all over the world. It's an innovative instrument for the government procurement system. So after this brief introduction, I would like to give the floor to the next speaker so that we can discuss, for example, Vasyl Zadvornyi, who is the Director General of ProZorro. What are the risks and challenges? Let us discuss this. Well, speaking about the victories, so to say, of this and achievements of all our team, I would also like to say a few words about our work, about our achievements, but I would like to start with the following. The very idea emerged, and when I discussed that with the foreigners, for example, it's not a novelty for them, but for the Ukrainians, this transparency is a cornerstone, so to say, and this idea has been expressed by a number of my colleagues that many of them said that a combination of transparency but at the same time of some corruption components, they say about this asymmetry of information. Our system provides the grounds for and access to the information on the public procurement, and as the end of the year is usually the time of making some conclusions, of overseeing the results and analyzing the results. I recall 2013, some previous years, like 5 years ago, it would be inconceivable even to imagine a system which makes public all the data related to government and public procurement. Everybody considered that sphere at that time a highly corrupt system, and therefore I would like to tell you how this use of the open data helps to improve the situation in economic life of our country and influence the other spheres of life of this country. For example, 50,000 enterprises, private enterprises, got access and acceded to this system, started using it. Approximately 300 suppliers have already presented their documents. They read the information that they needed, and that's the number that does not take into account the number of requests from the journalists, information requests from the journalists. 50,000 businesses, they encompass a large share, probably the largest share of our domestic market. So with this system, we do not invent a bicycle. We just use the rules of open market. The costs of access to the market has decreased, and these opportunities to save the costs, it facilitated economic activities. I remember that previously in the Ukrainian legislation there was a provision that prohibited expressly for some public institutions, governmental institutions, to deal with private suppliers of goods and services unless they are checked and verified and so on. But now, today, thanks to the ProZorro system, thousands of companies started participating in the public procurement. And for the public purse, this means a large economy, large savings. We can say that the annual amount of the money is saved by the ProZorro system for the budget of the government is approximately about $1 billion. I can say that on summarizing our experience of the last 2.5 years while this system has been functioning. It can this argument can be expanded, elaborated on by saying that we increase our IT capacity. We have now the processing capacity in terabytes of data, and that also facilitates the functioning of this public procurement system. And this machine-readable data, it makes possible for any supplier, any company to participate in this public procurement system. It's very good for our clients. And it's been emblematic that for the last year I haven't heard any complaints or any statements or objections from the government officials who used to refer to all the data that is in possession of government institutions, that it's made open. For example, our British partners who have already made a lot of significant strides in using open data. For them, it was their assessments was very positive, and they all were of the opinion that the open data is good. For example, we made accessible and open the data on the procurement and the purchases of medicines. So the state is just opening the data that is in its possession. It's just a couple of fields in the government-owned database, and from that, from those we can derive the data, we can analyze the situation with the purchases of medicines, different medicines, and we can see the prices at which different public hospitals, for example, buy aspirin or whatever medicines they need. We could see how the bidding procedures are organized. Some entities only have one or two bidders or a few bidders. The others have a large number of bidders. And if you have this data open and open to the analysis, then you can use all these statistics for further improvements. And one of the precedent at the global level was the opening and the risk indicators for the state agencies that control, for example, these bidding procedures. For example, all the stages of submitting the documents, bidding documents, can be controlled, and the risks could be seen, like, for example, the lack of an electronic signature or something. And a lot of indicators can signal the breaches of the tender procedures or bidding procedures. Like, for example, one and the same supplier is always winning the tenders at this or the other government agency or institutions, and the other suppliers always lose. It can be detected quite quickly, and these risks could be analyzed. The state auditing service has, thanks to this system, has detected a number of breaches from one of the governmental institutions when they were buying supplies for some refurbishment and renovation works from one and the same supplier. So this system of risks detection is functioning, and it also gives an opportunity to the control agencies to control, to monitor all the machine-readable information that is uploaded into the system. So after having this system of detection, these breaches could be detected more or less automatically because there are the documents, they are attested by electronic signatures, and the documents are in a comfortable electronic format. And thanks to these electronic documents, you could see any actions as they are done by any organization, any entity. We are opening our data not only for the government organizations, but also for the civil society organizations and activists. There are 14 instruments of business analysis. They were developed through the Open Contracting Partnership program. They were developed by the summer of this year by different private companies. And it cost nothing to the budget, to the public budget. All these instruments facilitate the analysis of the data that we have in the ProZorro system. For example, the data can be analyzed on the shares of the market, and these instruments are capable of analyzing all the transactions. And all our customers can use these documents and if, for example, in our system there are 4,000 procurement procedures declared each day, it's difficult to control them, to monitor them. But the electronic formats make it much easier for the whole system to operate, makes it easier. It's not the PDF, tons of PDF documents. We are planning that from next February we will be able also to sample the different purchases by the terms, dates of payments and purchases. For example, there are some delays with payments, like, for example, some incorrect terms of payments, like 270 days, for example. There were such cases. It also relieves the companies from presenting the data that the government entities, government organizations already have. This data has been accumulated, integrated from the registers of private businesses, of the individual entrepreneurs. And so the fiscal service of the Ministry of Finance, the Treasury, they can all use this data. And so this integrated system makes all this data available to all of us. We are also working on improving the artificial intelligence instruments used for our system, like, for example, the recommendation development, like, for example, the Amazon website does. If you look at a book, you can see that the website generates the recommendation that together with this book, the following items are most frequently purchased. If in any tender there are at least 10 pages of documents, and if you participate in only 1% in purchases that occur in the country, then each week you have 750 pages of documents, of information that you need to look through. So the machine can do that instead of you. And now we are developing the catalogs. And when the data itself could be purchased with one click. And that's probably all. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize once again that we view open data as a good instrument that should exist as an element of the honest cooperation between the state, between the government and the society. And the openness of the data without the people who use that data is not functioning. So you should always have the user of this open data in mind. For example, the electronic tax returns, for example, how they are used, how they are analyzed, that's a good example. Thank you very much, Vasyl, for your overview, for your detailed analysis. And I would only like to remind you that the Open Data Barometer of this year showed Ukraine as one of the 30 countries leaders in the world on processing open data and opening access to the data. I was doing the research for this Open Data Barometer on Ukraine, and the information about the use of public funds for public procurement procedures, Ukraine is one of the leaders in this realm. If we look at some specific sectors like construction sector, healthcare, not only in terms of the spending of the budget, but the budgets themselves in different sectors. Here the situation is a little bit worse, but it shows how the government works with the businesses and how both the businesses and the public use this data. So these indicators on the innovation, inclusiveness. In Ukraine, these parameters have improved, and the data, we have more and more services on the data of purchases, on the tax returns, electronic tax returns, and a number of other initiatives on the use of data. For example, one of the recent initiatives is important, for example, for me, because I am from Chernivtsi, where we have very bad roads. And when we speak about the road repairment, I have a feeling that if someone takes the task of monitoring the data on how funds are spent there, maybe the contractors would be more responsible, feel more responsibility in performing, in doing their works. Now I would like to turn the floor over to Natalia Forsiuk, who is the director of the initiative of the Construction Transparency Initiative, which is the initiative that monitors the honesty and transparency of the expenditures of public funds through ProZorro system. And so you can present your analysis with the emphasis on how this data is used. Thank you, Nadia. Really, as they say, if you want to find corruption, follow the money. In the infrastructure projects in any country, the flows of money are the largest. So traditionally, all infrastructure projects, not only the road building, but it could be sewerage, railroad construction in any country, these projects are they draw most attention from international donors, international investors who would like to invest their money, and also the people who and businesses who would like to use these investments, these funds. In Ukraine, the initiative, this initiative monitored mostly the road sector. Some expertise we have also in the power sector, in energy sector. And this year we wanted to spread our activities to the regions, and we wanted to show that it was possible to teach the citizens who are interested to monitor the quality of the works. How can we use the data available for that? Without ProZorro, I'd say it would be very difficult, if not impossible. So ProZorro is our first and primary source where we can find all the information on all public procurements of any supply, any contractor, and we can use the link 007 through which we get access to the information related to the quality of the works. The information related to the purchases, public procurement contracts, it shows the dynamic of the prices, who participated, and in the contracts, all the contracts are impossible to analyze, but our purpose is to analyze the budget of each contract, of each project. What works are to be done in accordance with that budget. But I would also like to say, to point to what ProZorro does not show, what data it doesn't provide. First of all, infrastructural projects that have capital investments, like any renovations, any repairment works, they have a lot of project-related documents and documentation. But there is not a single digital code for a project that would indicate the fact that this project, for example, involved these project documents, design documents, the budget documents, and so on, balance sheets, and so on. It's difficult to find this data and to analyze them. We need to look through numerous projects, look through the contracts, the purchases and the documents related to purchases. How do they match, for example, with this or the other part of the road, section of the road? Therefore, it's the area in which the IT development is needed, so that it enables finding more information on any specific project and contract. The problem does not end with the procurement procedure, bidding procedure. Vasyl was very clever in pointing out this strange combination, typically Ukrainian combination of transparency and corruption in our economic life. When we speak about different contracts, including the road repairment, for example, we should understand that any procurement procedure should have as its result the completion of works, not the completion of the bidding procedure. So when the organization that ordered these works and the supplier, the contractor, they confirm by their signatures that the works are done and they correspond to a certain criteria. We can yet analyze that only through this act of completion of works and not otherwise. Therefore, within our joint project with the United Nations Development Programme and with the other non-governmental organizations, there were 13 organizations in total. We tried to teach the people doing quite complex things, but to do these things in a simple way. People are mostly used to stay at a computer, or the other people can only operate in the field, so to say. But to combine that is quite difficult, but interesting. And regrettably, we have discovered that almost 90% of the objects that we have examined, they had some shortcomings, something that was not completed or done with poor quality. Some of the deficiencies, for example, in the road surfaces had cracks, and it means that if such things are detected, such defects are detected, then probably 90% of the funds allocated for that and spent for that or the other project were misspent. So what we need to analyze is to analyze the proportion of what amount of money was spent of the total amount of money allocated. Like, for example, in our Chernivtsi region, there was a case when the road surface was paved when it was covered with ice. And it happens all over Ukraine, in Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast or administrative region, and in the Ternopil and the other areas of Ukraine. So these purchases and these procurement procedures could have been done in a perfectly transparent manner, and but the quality of works was as I described. And it's not that I blame the ProZorro system. It's not its competence, so to say, area of competence. But what should be done in order to analyze and to assess the results of these public procurement projects? It can only be done visual with some physical material inspection. Without any damaging means of control. So it's a difficult task, and people who are willing to be engaged in doing these tasks, they have to learn more and more. But so far, we have accumulated gathered some interesting results, and we are going to present them together with the infrastructure minister on December the 18th. I'm not going to reveal any more secrets, because otherwise you will not be interested to go to that presentation, to that meeting. But we worked jointly with the leaders of some of the local administrations. And I would like also to point out that this open data problem is that there are no reports on the monitoring of the quality of the products and services that are purchased through a ProZorro system. And, for example, there was 30 million allocated for our work, but for example, the reports on the results of the quality control organization, what were the results? You cannot find any information on that. So what defects have they detected? What has been done to make the contractors to remove these defects? No information about that. So if it's worthwhile to make a tool, to make an instrument to gather and publicize, make this information public, so that the public monitoring organizations could also pay their attention to that. That is probably, that brings us to the end of my brief presentation. Well, I also recalled that with the auditing of the data, when you visit the departments that deal with utilities, I mean the local administrations, governmental administrations, they are sometimes amazed when we ask from them the documents related to the contracts, reports on the quality of works, and so on. But at the same time, there are, let me remind you that the local administrations, local councils and administrations, they usually have the departments of technical and technological control in their structures. But they usually hide that information, these reports on the quality of work. And so all that information is in the contracts, but it somehow is diluted in various addenda to the contracts, and you have one figure in the contract, but when you look at the results, how much money was spent, the figures differ. So thank you very much for your wonderful presentations and your very interesting reports. And what about questions, if any members of the audience have any questions? I personally have some questions on the future, future plans and intentions, and when we speak about different signals of some defects or shortcomings in different open data systems. For example, the electronic tax returns. We know that, for example, the access was prohibited to the tax returns of the members of the police and special services like military prosecutor's office. And recently I learned also that the judges, the member of the judiciary, want their electronic declarations to be made confidential. And the arguments here are that people who reveal information about their wealth, they start fearing to be robbed, for example. So there is this counter-reaction, or reaction rather, to this trend, to this tend to openness, to transparency. Speaking again about ProZorro, it's not a secret that the auditing service of Ukraine does not work. We want it to work because they have certain limitations by law. For example, the limitations to public procurement, transactions. So how these, for example, the purchases, public procurement transactions that do not reach the limits, can the procedures, bidding procedures there could be somehow improved?
Тому що, наприклад, про ідентифікацію.
Because if we speak about the identification code for the public procurement supplies, we discussed that yet a year ago. So what should be done in order to improve the situation in this area? I understand that my question might not be related directly with your work, but again, if my broad question is, if we do not broaden, enlarge the coverage of this trend to transparency and openness, how at least to preserve the positions that we have already gained? Well, my suggestion is that we should treat the open data as the data that contains some personal information. But again, as Vasyl mentioned, this data should be treated as live data, so to say, change that is that is changing, is dynamic. So for the organizations that are involved in the monitoring, it will be interesting to use that data, how different parameters are changed, and so for some organizations, some changes could be analyzed effectively, and some wrongdoings or breaches can be identified. And again, this is one of the large international commitments of Ukraine. For example, this access to electronic tax returns, for example, it's one of the items of the plan of action for the implementation of the Ukraine-EU association agreement. Well, I can also comment that large strata of issues that you have touched upon. Well, first of all, for me, this narrowing down of to the open data is what I describe as the resistance of the environment. These collisions, they appear regularly in this realm of public procurement. And people continue asking whether it was worthwhile to make this data on public procurement, all the data, make it open. But having in mind this goal for which this data is made open, I understand that, for example, in the case of electronic tax returns, we are not driven by the desire just to show to everybody who has who possesses what assets. It's an instrument that we should work in order to make the system more transparent. Regarding the operation, the functioning of ProZorro system and these smaller purchases, public purchases and procurement projects, it's a big task, and the bill that was presented in the Parliament on these small-scale purchases was not approved by the Parliament, which means that around 350,000 public purchases remain in shadow, so to say. You also raised the issue of different aspects of using the budget, the money from the national budget. It's the money flow is not limited only to the bidding procedure. It's also the budgeting procedure and so on and so forth. So if we speak about this first stage, I would say that we continue this movement towards the integration of our database with the Treasury, and a lot of work has been done by the ministries in order to put some regulatory documents in place in order to provide the access to the data on the budgets and different budget expenditures, how the allocations for certain programs were expanded, and you could use, for example, using the Google Maps system, you could photograph a section of a road and verify how it was constructed, whether the quality of construction was satisfactory, and so on. So the citizens ideally should be able to do that. The only thing I would like to point out is that it is important for us to maintain this gradual progress, this gradual movement. Certainly, it's impossible to do everything at once, but I'd say that we have already done a tremendous amount of work, I would say a leap into the future for Ukraine, but a lot of space should yet be covered. Well, the question is quite complicated, in fact. The issue you have raised about the identifying code of for infrastructure projects in the developed countries, it has existed. They have existed for years. So whatever lots, bidding lots, whatever projects there are, they are all associated by these codes, and in our country, it's difficult because different level budgets are not related among themselves, and in many cases, the ministries are unaware of the total amount of projects that they finance or co-finance, and how these projects in procurement could be also somehow related, and all that related to the planning procedures. It's still very, very difficult. The planning procedure by itself is probably one of the most corrupt stages of the project planning in Ukraine. The bidding procedure has not yet initiated, but it suddenly becomes clear that technologically only one company in all of Ukraine is capable of delivering the services that are envisaged by that project. For example, if we speak about the roads, you need to take into account the length of a section of the road, then the budgeting, how much would cost a certain distance of the road, and then you could analyze using these cost data. You can try to somehow compare different roads and different sections of different roads in different regions, and how much money was spent and how effectively was it spent. But the data is yet lacking, and but sometimes we can, even with the data available, we can see that some portions of the roads are quite expensive as compared to the other sections of the other roads. Thank you, dear speakers, dear panelists, and thank you, dear participants. Let me conclude by saying that open data is our asset, and we as the citizens of this country should have access to this data, and not to allow this reaction of reducing this transparency. We need to remain proactive and generate requests and so on. Thank you, and see you next time.